Okay, my name's Jason Bradley. I'm pleased to be here. I have some big shoes to fill. A few people had said that last year's keynote speaker was so engaging, and someone else said, well, you're at the end of the day, it's got to be great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how I got here, where I came from, but I spent lots of time on the back of a horse. So in my best 4-H speech strategy, you got to say something at the beginning to get everybody engaged. So I'm looking at all of you and get you ready for the next little bit. So I'm going to tell you to do up your cinches tight, and we're going to giddy up and get through this presentation. It came from a few weeks ago. I wrote a note into Agrivoltaics Canada, and I said, hey, I'm interested in coming to the conference, because I thought you had to apply. And I think Mike and Pat got back to me, and we had a little meeting, and I flipped them through this presentation that I built as a 2.5-hour workshop for a company that I'm doing work with. So we're going to do that in just around 40 minutes. So that's kind of how I got here. And they said, hey, well, could you do that as the keynote? And I'm like, okay, let's give that a shot. So where do I come from? So just career-wise, I spent the first 10 years of my career at this little-known Canadian company called Nortel Networks. Before it imploded, and before I knew anything about that, I left that to go manage a 50,000-acre cattle ranch. So cattle ranching's in my DNA. I'm a 4th-generation Albertan. My great-grandparents came across, and some of them homesteaded and ran cattle. So our friends owned this large ranch. They're non-resident owners, and I went out to the Red Deer River Ranch with my young family to manage this place. But I had never calved a cow out on my own yet. So little known fact, but I've done a lot of things in my career without having had a lot of previous experience. Thus, I have this non-linear career path. So I did that for 19 years. I left there to go to an agricultural college to teach one class for one semester, kind of part-time while I was still at the ranch. Didn't even have an undergrad degree yet. Stood at the front of the class like this. I have never been that scared in my entire life. And I've been in front of grizzly bears, cougars, wolves, wild horses, you name it. So I did that for a semester, and they said, hey, why don't you stay? You've got a technology background, you've got a project management background, you've got an ag background. Why don't you stay and help us put together this supercluster bid, which I did, and that we came in a close second. And out of that came the idea for the Olds College Smart Farm. So they said, well, could you stay and help us define, design, implement the first phase of the Olds College Smart Farm? By the way, we have no budget, and we don't really have a full-time job for you. And I said, okay. So I did that, but I spent 4 years there, and I learned about what it was to do academic research, applied research. I learned about academic teaching and learning. I got motivated enough, I actually went and finished my master's, just did that a couple of years ago. And so I've, done all that. I spent a year in an ag tech startup at the end of my time at Olds College with a company that was measuring soil carbon at the atomic level. So for creating soil carbon credits. So that was like Jimmy Neutron stuff, like way beyond my pay grade, but they asked me to be the president of this company, so I spent a year doing that, helping them to commercialize that. And then since then, I've been building this regenerative agriculture management practice. So that's kind of where I came from and where I am. So we're going to talk about Agrivoltaics 101. So regenerative is, I'm going to talk about that. Way beyond sheep. Sheep are a huge part of it that we saw from this panel and so far today, but we're going to move beyond that to talk about what is possible and what's already being done in other places and how do we put this together. Okay? So are we all good with that? All right. So here's what agrivoltaics shouldn't look like. And I'm careful when I show this, but here's what it shouldn't look like. It shouldn't look like that. That's a project in Alberta. They did some things differently there than some of the projects I'm working on, and it's caused a lot of other challenges over a 4,000-acre footprint. Let's just put it that way. 300 acres of grass came up over 4,000 acres, and they've got some work to do. What could it look like? It should look like this. This is an example of not a project I've worked on, but so here's what I do. My little consulting firm, Regener8ve. We're called to partner in redeeming creation, and the number 8 in my name just talks about regenerating a new beginning, a new order, and new hope. So I do a baseline analysis, which we're going to talk about. I do soil sampling for biological soil health. which is a big part of regenerative agrivoltaics. I make some system-based recommendations and plans and help you implement them, and then I coach and mentor. So how do we change our thinking and our paradigms and practices to achieve better outcomes? So how do we go beyond conventional agriculture? How do we go beyond just photovoltaics? How do we actually do something that combines those, and even beyond that, to a regenerative approach to that? So there's different academics, and Cotter talks about the 8-step change model, where you create urgency, you form a coalition, you create a vision for change, you communicate the vision, remove obstacles, create short-term wins, build on the change, and anchor the change in corporate culture. So that's some of the things that I do with companies and with farmers and ranchers, and I think that we need to do here beyond this room is to help make better outcomes. Consumers are looking for things that have to do with creating a better environment, looking at climate change, animal welfare, food safety, water quality, the list goes on and on. I hear a lot about things should be sustainable. It's one of my least favorite words. Like, why do we want to leave things the same as they are? Why don't we want to work together to make things better? And they want foods that are positive for their mind, body, and environment. So, in good academic rigor, I built this model when I was at grad school. Still, obviously, don't know enough about any of this yet, but I said, okay, well, if I was to build a model, how do we get to common ground? How do we get to a place where we can all agree that there's something that we can agree to and we're not so polarized? I said, in agriculture, there's sort of 4 different ways to approach primary production. The common ground, this is my opinion, and I'll ask for your thoughts on this after, so there's gonna be test questions out in the lobby. I think common ground comes around profitability, functional soil health, and the nutrient density of food. I think that's where I have learned that we can draw a circle around, because if we look at the 4 different kinds of primary production, there's conventional production, which does some things like increasing yield, which we're feeding almost 8 billion people now, but there's high chemical inputs. There's other issues around soil health, compaction, salinity, for example, pH. There's a depletion of soil health because we're mining the carbon out of soil. We have been since we came here 150 years ago and started practicing, tillage and then other types of practices, and there's reduced nutritional value. Organic, there might be, some avoidance of chemical inputs, but there's high tillage. There's maybe increased nutritional value, but it continues rather to deplete soil health. It's actually harder on soil health than conventional. And there's an economic dependence. The same with sustainable. There's a big dependence on programs, quite a bit in Canada, lots in the US. It's yield focused, and it's the status quo. It says, well, let's keep things the way they are. Let's sustain that. And I'm like, well, we can do way better. But then there's regenerative. It's profit focused instead of yield focused, which is a mind shift for most people. It builds functional soil health, it improves the nutrient density of food, and it strengthens communities through creating rural economic development and resilience. So regenerative agriculture, there's a couple definitions. You can read the top one if you have time, but the bottom one is someone that I work with. He's sort of known as one of the leaders in the space. It's about farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, restore ecosystem function, starting with life in the soil and expanding to all life above the soil. So that's a definition. There'll be other definitions out there, but I think it's a good place to start to say, well, how do we actually regenerate soil health? What's regenerative agrivoltaics? So I took a stab at this and I said, well, it's the combination of solar energy production and regenerative farming and ranching, and it solves multiple problems at once. So energy production, food production, soil health. It increases net margins for farmers and ranchers. It improves functional soil health by sequestering atmospheric CO2, which there's a lot that goes on with that. And it ensures regenerative and highly nutrient-dense food production. So that's my definition. I'm more than welcome to chat with you about that, what you think. Okay, so let's talk about regenerative agriculture. Works really well as a system. It's not an ideology, it's not an orthodoxy, it's not a religion. It is about a systematic nature-based framework. And there's 3 components to it. There's 6 principles of soil health, there's 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and 4 ecosystem processes. So the first one of the 6 principles, and this is in the context of, I'm applying this to agrivoltaics as well. It works in all agriculture. It is, first of all, you have to know your context. So, Raphael, you talked about it's not an easy place maybe to raise cattle necessarily in some places where you're raising sheep. That's knowing your context, right? Like what makes sense there. So that you have to know. Then you don't disturb the ground. That's just, it's one of the principles. You have to have cover on the soil and build surface armor. You have to keep the soil covered, because if you don't, you're going to have stress from heat, you're going to have wind erosion, and you're going to be losing the microbiology. You have to mix it up. You have to have many different plants, microbes, insects, wildlife, livestock, etc. Okay, so question for you. Put your hand up if you've ever seen a monoculture growing in nature. Have you ever seen just one plant growing for 500? Okay, what's that?
Japanese knotweed.
Okay, I don't know anything about that. This is awesome.
It's just like a super invasive plant we have in Ontario, and it just takes over everything.
So it becomes its own sort of monoculture.
Yeah, and you try and dig it up, and it just, like, it spreads through rhizomes, and it just goes nuts.
Do sheep eat it?
No. Well, not that I know of.
They might.
They could.
Anyway, so okay, so I'm gonna keep that.
Invasion, right? That's not natural.
Well, yeah. So I think if I can get agreement that there is nowhere like in an ecosystem where there's a monoculture, but we grow canola by the 1,000 acres at a time in Alberta, and corn in the Midwest U.S. We have to keep a living root in the soil, and we have to integrate animals. Without that together, then those principles actually don't stand on their own. The 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are the rule of compounding. Things are always either cascading up or cascading down. They never stay in a place of stasis. There is a natural disruption that's really important. Natural systems respond really well to disruption, and so you have to plan that into managing through adaptive stewardship. And then diversity, because nature doesn't support a monoculture. It always needs to have a diversity within it, and you need to manage it and introduce those things in such a way that you maintain that. And then the 4 ecosystem processes. So don't try and read the small print. I can share this with you. So this is about energy flow. So plants photosynthesize, but so do solar panels, essentially, right? It's actually biomimicry of what plants do. And so there's an energy flow, and you have to create photosynthetic capture, which is how you calculate the efficiency of a solar panel and a solar array, is understanding, well, how much actual efficiency is there. It's the same with plants. And you don't want to have photosynthetic leakage, because you're losing money if you do that. Water cycle, so it's about managing that water cycle and creating better water use efficiency within the soil profile. The mineral cycle, so plants actually access minerals in the soil and can create mineralization and plant available nutrients. And then again, diversity is one of the processes. I actually add in carbon here because I think it's the 5th one. I haven't got my colleagues to add that in there, but I think it's separate enough that it doesn't just get included under the mineral cycle. Okay, so who was talking about soil testing before? So you were talking about soil testing a little bit. So I thought of this. So this is a soil test unit that I bought, and I run this. The derrick tilts up. I can test down to 50 inches. I send soil cores away they're all geolocated based on the size of the field, the management zones. But I don't do just conventional nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. I look at, well, I don't look at, but the lab, we look at the biological function of the soil. So looking at things like, if you look at this soil health area, what's the soil respiration rate of CO2 coming out of the soil? What's organic carbon? What's the carbon to nitrogen ratio? Like looking at that as a functioning system and not just getting, I think we've been distracted on looking at macronutrients. That was a good way to do soil testing when we were really focused on conventional chemistry based. I also send to the same lab the same soil cores, and they go for phospholipid fatty acid testing, which compares the ratios basically of mycorrhizal fungi to bacteria. In most of our farm soils, they're almost all bacteria because we've either used tillage and mechanically disrupted the mycorrhizal fungi, or we've used other inputs, especially things like glyphosate, which glyphosate's an antibiotic. The soil is made out of biota. Something in that doesn't make sense to me. So we want to look at what those ratios are and change our practices to start to create balance in that. One of the things that I do, soil test is just one part of it. I do water infiltration testing, compaction testing, and I do other observations. And I designed this system because I was trying to figure out, well, how would I tell the owner of an agrivoltaics farm or any other farm or ranch, well, how are they doing? What's their baseline? So I built this scoring system that every one of the 6 principles of soil health, every one of the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and every 4 ecosystem processes, I score each one of those pillars from a -3 to a +3, and I do it by field. And then I take the score of that field for the 6, 3, 4, and then it gets turned into, if you look up the -19, I score each field, and then I score the whole farm or ranch together. So you can look at your field and see what the number is. Those numbers are also attached if you look at the color scheme on the left side. The greener it is, the higher the number is, the more healthy your soil and your system is. And then the farmer can look at either a field or a ranch or the whole ranch together and figure out where are they at for a baseline and what buttons do they push and levers do they pull to create change, and then measure that change based on a number of different factors. This is what healthy soil should look like. That's on the left, 10 years of conventional tillage and conventional use of pesticides and synthetic nutrients. And the right is zero till. So the same soil, but using different approaches to the management of it. Soil should look like the texture of black cottage cheese or chocolate cake. That's what it should look like, because the soil aggregation that occurs in here, where all the glomalin and the other parts of the soil are healthy, there should be a lot of aggregation. You should see all the different root structure already coming through the soil, and lots evidence of worms, because worms like it when there's a lot of biology and a lot of health in the soil. There's another picture of what healthy soil should look like. So I've gone on to, I was on a client's ranch. They don't use any synthetics, they don't use any fertilizer, but it has been overgrazed for decades, and it was 3,300 acres. I did dozens and dozens of soil pits. I found one wormhole, but no live worms across the whole ranch. And I'm like, well, that's a problem. And so how does that apply to agrivoltaics, and how do we create a system design and management of that system so that we're actually driving for soil health, not just for production? And I think that's the common ground that I'll keep coming back to, that we can all use within this room to create projects, to create applications for funding, and to help even regulatory bodies, to help investors and insurance companies look at, like I've been talking with our provincial insurance, crop insurance folks. They're starting to see the value in farmers and ranchers increasing soil carbon because it creates resilience in their ecosystem. It drives profitability, which creates resilience in their business, and then they can actually attract a lower rate because they have a more resilient system. There's banks in Canada that are looking at the same thing. They're looking at, oh, if there's more carbon in your soil, as a landowner or as a renter, you're going to be a lower risk. So they're looking at how can we give them better rates on equipment, on land loans, and on operating loans. Okay, this is 86 cow-calf pairs in 0.35 acres. So I built this crop cocktail. I'm standing right in the road here. That's what it should look like after it's been trampled and eaten for 48 hours. But that crop grew, it was 8 different forage plants, but it grew without any synthetic fertilizer, no herbicide, no fungicide. It's like over the top of those cows' head. And so that's what it can look like when you let the synergy of plants and animals work together. Now, 0.35 acres is about 6 of these rooms. So there was 86 cow-calf pairs on there for 48 hours. That's the kind of healthy impact that we need to have in regenerative agrivoltaics to drive soil health and to get us where we need to go. Okay, I'm going to read a couple notes here just to make sure that I get this correct. So one of my clients is Kuitno Energy Corp. That name comes from being bestowed upon the company founder and the company by some indigenous friends of theirs. Kuitno is a producer, a buyer, a consolidator, and a developer of gas-fired solar and wind power with multiple grid-scale projects in the ASO grid access and regulatory approval queue. Their prime directive identifies 7 distinct groups of people where they focus on sustainability initiatives, one of which is communities most impacted by the company's activities, including indigenous communities who want to participate in planning, building, and operating projects, and in restoring the land when projects are done. So, in quotes from their recent ESG report, our goal is to integrate agricultural activities into our solar renewable developments, harnessing regenerative agriculture practices to protect and enhance soil health while continuing to produce valuable agricultural products. So that's a statement that they've made. I spend a couple days a week with this company, helping them to define, design, and implement their agrivoltaics plan. It's not easy. It's definitely a non-linear path to get to where the end of that is. So this is where they're located across Alberta in terms of their different projects. You can see how they're listed out between conventional oil and gas on one side and sustainable on the other. So they're an energy in transition company from wells to watts. I actually quite like that. It's pretty fun for me because I also spent time as a fellow at the Energy Futures Lab. So it's an Alberta-based think tank trying a group of folks from all different kinds of energy trying to figure out this transition from conventional to renewable energy. And they asked me to come on as the ag person. And I was always that guy that was like, okay, but what about like carbon capture, utilization, and storage? I was like, okay, but what about putting that carbon in the soil where we really need it? Like, let's focus on that. So I was always that guy in our workshops that was kind of pulling them there. So Kuitno is getting there. This is some of the soil testing that was done at the Homestead project. So down in Claresholm, it's a 400 megawatt project over 2,600 acres. So this is utility scale. Some work already being done on this, getting closer to construction next year, it sounds like. It depends on when some things get lined up for their finances. But we were at a landowner meeting just a week ago, and one of the landowners from the Granham Hutterite colony, after the end of the meeting, he just piped up and he said, this is such a better approach compared to our other solar project, because the company was engaging with the landowners, asking for their input, trying to figure out what that even looks like. So that's one of the things I'm working on with their construction team, the landowners, environmental health and safety, and their executive leadership team, is to develop a plan to integrate regenerative agrivoltaics into their project models. So, and some of those models look like, okay, well, we've got 6 different landowners on this solar project, and then we've got the energy company, then we've got the rest of the community. Those are all stakeholders, but the invested people are the landowners and the energy company. How do we create some kind of operating entity going forward to make decisions on agrivoltaics? There's a lot of complication there. So I'm thinking through models that look like an advisory group to begin with, and then an agriculture cooperative, a social enterprise, a benefit corporation or a B Corp, a collective impact or a joint venture. Like, what do those even look like going forward so that group of people can make decisions on all kinds of shared land, shared value, shared resources, shared income? Like, it's a pretty complicated, but not impossible task by any means. Solar utility. So I was super excited to hear the folks from polar racking, and I went and talked to them after. So polar racking, if I've got this right, which I think I do, is working with this Calgary-based company called Solartility. Sorry, I forgot your name. You're talking about insurance and cattle. So people get wigged out when I talk about cattle and solar, but you can't just put cattle out on a solar farm like you can sheep and manage it, because they are bigger and they rub. So this is, when I think about putting cattle on solar, I think about precision grazing, and we're going to look at some examples of what that is. So this company, Solartility, their whole business model is based on integrating cattle and upright or vertical bifacial panels. But they're doing it with the scale of 1 megawatt on about 10 acres. Those upright panels obviously minimize the land footprint. And then within that design, they're integrating high tensile electric fence. So the panel structure also becomes the fence for cattle. So interestingly, just last week, it can be officially announced that Emissions Reduction Alberta, which takes carbon taxes and through a tier system, taxes emitters, and then makes available funding for projects around addressing GHG. So one of the projects that they just announced was Solartility. So $6.3 million project, $3.1 million for funding. It's going to be put up at the University of Calgary WA Ranches, which is a 19,000 acre cattle ranch just outside of the city that was donated a couple of years ago. And so this project is going to go there, and I'm just helping Solartility define some of the cattle management and other things. Haven't done a lot with them yet, but they're just getting rolling on that. So lots going on in Alberta, and this is an example of way beyond sheep. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'm sure I pulled this off the web, but these 5 C's of agrivoltaic project success, they make a lot of sense to me in terms of using that up front to define what the climate is of the growing area, how you want to affect that, the configuration of the whole design, what crops and cultivation, what kind of compatibility is there between infrastructure and agriculture, and then how do you create collaboration, and some of those things that I'm trying to figure out, like how do you create some sort of entity defined to manage that. Okay, so we're not going to read through all these, but I did do a SWOT analysis, and I would love your input on this as well. But getting ready for this workshop, I thought, well, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? So there is increased solar panel efficiency through the biomimicry from evapotranspiration of plants. We saw that earlier today, and the research I found says that. But there's also the benefit to plants and animals as well. There's the possibility for enhanced ag productivity, improved functional soil health, increased profitability. If you can do this properly, then you reduce the competition for highly productive land. You actually create collaboration for that same, I heard it called Class A land or Class 1 land in Ontario. Alberta's trying to figure out the same thing, but you actually use that to the advantage of the project. You create a distributed energy or a distributed food system. So I borrowed this from my friends at the Energy Futures Lab. I kept hearing about these distributed energy systems, but what about creating a distributed food system? So within communities where the commodities coming off the farm are processed and values added to those in community, and then you're disaggregating that from these huge global supply chains, which 3 years ago in COVID, we were all not only worried about where we were going to get our next roll of toilet paper, but we had like beef processing plants. In Alberta, they almost all shut down. We have 85% of the country's beef processing capability. Like, these are big problems that aren't going to go away. The weaknesses are there's potential for reduced plant and animal productivity, non-desirable plant proliferation. Some people call those weeds, but weeds are plants too. There can be a reduction in soil health if things aren't designed properly up front and then managed. I'm going to make a t-shirt, weeds are plants too. Okay, here's a question. I'm trying to be engaging and I got 10 minutes left. Why do weeds grow where they are?
To repair the soil.
To repair the soil, because there's a problem there, right? So weeds are like nature's answer to fixing a problem. And so we have to think beyond just spraying them. We have to think about how do we fix what the problem is and make it so that the weeds don't want to hang out there. We were talking about even kochia. You guys were saying that your sheep go in, they'll clean it out, and actually make a huge improvement on the kochia percentage of the stand, right?
I guess that was one of my questions I had. So you talked about obviously keeping plants in the soil. If we're talking about crop production, you have these months long of, you know, fallow land where there's nothing growing. I guess what are the opportunities at that point?
Cover crops.
Being a monoculture, or how would you?
So it's not as easy to think about sometimes in a Western Canadian growing condition, but cover crops are the idea of either planting like intercropping, and we're going to show an example of that. I keep checking the clock to make sure we get done. But or is it? There are times when you can, after harvesting wheat, let's say like winter wheat, that's you're going to harvest in July, is getting a crop actually established right after that. So like a fall rye and a vetch, that's going to start photosynthesizing, taking the liquids or taking the sun and turning that into liquid carbohydrates, putting that in the ground, feeding the soil microbiome, which that biota actually explodes in the population and then dies in the soil, and that's what sequesters carbon. So it's keeping the soil armored and covered with a living root in the soil. That's how you keep from. I heard someone talk about like this, the concern of 8 months of bare ground. Well, you never want to have any bare ground in this system. Does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We talk about monocultures, but then the hope for that is to put another monoculture in so that you don't have that land sitting.
Or you have polycrops growing.
Yeah, you would have to.
Yeah, and it's definitely attainable. Reclamation and remediation of land, so that's obviously, it's a risk and it can be a weakness if it's not properly lined out in the contracts. The opportunities, I'm sure most of you have seen this map. When I found it, I'm like, oh, well, no wonder why we want to build like solar agrivoltaic down here in Alberta, because it's one of the best places in the country. We have a deregulated market in Alberta. We've got a moratorium that some of you know about. We don't know what the outcomes of that will be. We do have well-established track record of relationships between energy companies and landowners. So it's not perfect by any means, but we've been doing that along with like Saskatchewan and some other provinces to a lesser degree. We have a long history of that regulatory and compliance laws and the rules that govern that. We have a mature ecosystem of renewable energy companies. We have a lot of opportunity for funded applied research. I should just stop. I heard mention about the RELP program, so Resilient Ag Landscape. I didn't know Ontario had that. Saskatchewan has a version of it. Manitoba's not quite there yet. Alberta has a great one. BC hasn't quite got theirs figured out, but that's money available for infrastructure. In Alberta, it's $150,000 cash for every landowner, and if you're Indigenous or Métis, it's $300,000 for offsite water systems, introducing legumes, and electric fencing for rotational grazing. So you got to have the money up front to pay for the project. You have to be able to prove that, but you get half the money when you're approved up front, and then at the end of 3 years, you get the other half. I don't know how it works in Ontario, but who is it that was talking about RELP in Ontario? I think she might have left. Yeah. So look into that, and that's my passion would be, well, how, and also the challenge. So 6 landowners on 2,600 acres, they have to make the application for the infrastructure. Okay, and then they're like, well, what do we get out of it? So we're putting up money up front. We're going to get the cash, half at the beginning, half at the end. But like, I could see them saying, well, why would we want to do that? Like, you're coming on and you're taking away all of our ag productivity. Yeah, you're paying us a lease payment. So some of these programs probably haven't even thought about these multi-user groups on pieces of land where there's a leaseholder and an owner. It could be a challenge. What are the threats? Well, the moratorium in Alberta, there's probably, I think all of us would agree, there could be way more research and practical data. I think not having a demonstration site of utility scale agrivoltaics is a big threat, because I hear it all the time from all parts that we need to see this in action at utility scale. There's an investment lost to other jurisdictions. when there's things like moratoriums, and the contracts, if they're not worded well, can definitely be a threat to the landowners. I just thought, well, what are some of the metrics for success around agrivoltaics, especially regenerative agrivoltaics? So profitability, for sure. I found this quote to be quite interesting because as humans, we found the best place to grow plants because of where the sun is and the right soil, but it's really about sun, which is the same with agrivoltaics. Maintaining food calories per acre. I think that's one of the ways that we can create a standard or some kind of measurement to say, what was the last 3 years of the crop, the commodity grown on that 160 acres? What were the averages, take the provincial average for canola yield or beef pounds or whatever that is, and then figure out the calories produced of that food. How many calories is that? And then there's going to be a whole bunch more, orders of magnitude more energy calories produced off of that. But if we can say there was X amount of calories grown on this acre of land and we can maintain that, why wouldn't that be the right standardized measurement of, we don't have a regime here yet where you have to, like, the one in Germany kind of confused me why they would base it on yield, and it sounded very restrictive. There would have to be a similar crop, which would prevent you from being able to put pigs or chickens or sunflower on that. But I think that's a way to do that. Improve functional soil health, enhance nutrient density of food, and ensuring economic and environmental resilience, I think, are other metrics for success. So what does enterprise scale regen agrivoltaics look like in a prairie-based broadacre arable farming enterprise? It looks like cover crops, which we talked about, and you can read about the benefits of that. This is piola. This is growing peas with canola. I have one of my clients up in Fairview, Alberta that has a couple different years now growing piola. I have another friend, associate, that grows clover with canola and uses no synthetic inputs because those legumes are nitrogen fixing. Above every acre of air, there's 36,000 tons of nitrogen. They fix nitrogen out of the air, put it in the soil. Canola needs the nitrogen. Everybody gets along. They can harvest the canola without the peas getting in the way. If they do harvest them together, then you put them through a seed separator in the yard. So there's different ways to do that. What kind of equipment? So this is Swarm Farm. This is small scale autonomous equipment. They're in Australia, also working in Canada. I'm hoping to set meetings up with them. They have different modifications of their equipment that they can use. This is an exact replication of within solar panels, right? The same with controlled traffic farming. My friend Steve Larocque is one of the global leaders. He took the inside tires off his Steiger tractor because that wheel width is the same as the wheel width on his sprayer and his combine. And he runs on auto steer, so every single path for 10 years he's run on the exact same part of that field. He's got better soil health than some regenerative farmers because he doesn't have that mechanical compaction. But that's the same thing that's going to happen when you think about farming in between panels. And then smaller equipment. So Pottinger, this is a European company. This is a seed drill. But it's like, and they come in 3, 4, and 5 meter widths. So the project that I'm working on right now is like 5 meters from edge to edge on the panels, just over. So that would fit down there. You're using auto steer. Those other devices have object detection. They have LiDAR and radar, and they use sub-inch accuracy in their steering, so it'd be next to impossible for them to run into a row of panels. It's way more likely a guy like me falls asleep and takes out a row of panels driving the tractor. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So back to what livestock species fit in this. It's sheep, it's chickens, it's pigs, it's pollinators, and it's cattle. I didn't know about these guys. I heard them mentioned before. I got to get connected with them. Precision grazing, so whether it's conventional, like high tensile electric fence that would restrict and contain and be a precision grazing approach in the rows. These are companies that I've actually talked to. They're US based, so they're using a GPS collar with an audible tone and a shock, so it trains the same as electric fence. But a cow gets close to the line, they got a shock the last time, but they hear a beep, and they actually learn not to go past the beep. And so you could have a collar like that and as a backup electric fence running down there to make sure that you weren't going to have any risk There's No Fence, which is a company out of Norway that's doing this, eShepherd, and there's a new company out of Calgary called Herd Whistle. And this company out of Winnipeg is called Uco Robotics. I've worked with them on other projects. This is a chicken barn that's completely autonomous. It's all run on GPS. And you would get them to build that the right width to go in the panels, and it would just run down. So this is thinking about multi-species stacked enterprise grazing. So this is like cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, and all doing that within the panels. Just quickly, this is evidence showing that forage crops can have better production with 45% shade or even 80% shade. This is showing the improvement in soil organic carbon from proper grazing. This was in an agrivoltaic, but this goes for whatever grazing you're doing on any other instance as well. This is my attempt at showing how to measure calories per acre. So if these are average wheat yields and weight and calories, same with barley and animal protein, like that to me is a way to say, here's the standard that we're in an arable like southern Alberta, Saskatchewan environment. Here's what our baseline is. But then like look at the difference in revenue opportunity. If we could grow a wheat or a canola, that's gross revenue based on an average yield in 2022 and the price of canola that year. But you start to stack that up. Let's say you grew a wheat crop, you were able to get some animals grazing on there. I used cattle because I'm more familiar with them, with a cover crop. And your solar lease payments, that's $2,900 per acre per year. So as a farmer, like I'll take that every day of the week. I'm not going to go through these, but these are case studies that I found, like companies that I think that are doing some good stuff. So I can talk about them after. Solartility I talked about. Silicon Ranch in the US I think is doing some really cool stuff as a solar company and working with Regener8ve farmers to manage what they're doing. The WA Ranch is one I talked about. There's Oya, and the last one is Ideal Energy.